I had 30 seconds before his knife touched that meat and the aconitine touched his blood. My hand didn't shake. That surprised me. I'd expected my fingers to betray me, to smear the ink across the napkin's white surface until the words became unreadable. But my hand was steady, almost clinical, the same steadiness that had gotten me through 12-hour hospital rotations and anatomy practicals and the kind of grief that hollows you out completely. I pressed the ballpoint hard, making sure each letter was unmistakable. 8 words. That was all the space I had, all the time I had. Don't eat the steak. Your stepmother poisoned it. Around me, the obsidian room breathed with the low, expensive rhythm of old money and older secrets. Crystal chandeliers threw amber light across white tablecloths. Conversations floated in murmurs the way voices sound when they've never had to compete with noise, when silence is something you can afford. Outside, the city hummed its indifferent song. But in here, everything was warm, gilded, suffocating. A terrarium built for predators. I smoothed the front of my black vest with one hand and folded the napkin with the other. I had a 7 a.m. pharmacology lecture in 9 hours. I had $340 left in my bank account after rent. I had 3 more tables to clear, 2 more hours on my shift, and absolutely no business inserting myself into whatever was about to happen at table 6. But I'd seen the chef's hands, and I knew what aconitine did to a human heart. It had started 40 minutes ago, in the cold belly of the restaurant. The obsidian room's kitchen corridor ran behind the main dining floor like a spine, long, narrow, lit with the harsh white fluorescence that the guests up front never saw. I'd been sent to retrieve a specific bottle of mineral water from the dry storage room at the far end, the still kind, room temperature, because one of our VIP guests had a preference. The kind of restaurant where guests have preferences about water temperature. I moved fast, heels quiet on the sealed concrete floor, mind already 3 steps ahead on my closing checklist. That's when I heard the stepmother's voice. Low, precise. The kind of voice that had spent decades practicing how to give instructions and never once raising itself to do so. Through the gap in the storage room door, I went still. She was standing at the chef's private station at the end of the prep corridor, the station reserved for VIP meals, separated from the main kitchen line. Chef Briggs had his back to me. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, but he was hunched over the counter like something was pressing him down from above. His hands, the hands that had cooked for governors and celebrities, were trembling. The stepmother stood beside him. She wore a cream silk blouse that probably cost what I made in a month, and her silver hair was set in perfect architectural waves. A large diamond ring caught the fluorescent light as she slid a small glass vial across the stainless steel surface toward him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. But the storage room was quiet, and I have always had very good ears. Into the glaze, all of it, and then you plate it and you serve it and you forget this happened. Chef Briggs didn't move. Your daughter is 11 years old, Chef, and she walks home from school alone. His hands stopped trembling. They went completely still, the stillness that comes after a man decides he has no choices left. He reached for the vial. I stopped breathing. I pressed myself against the storage room wall, the mineral water bottle cold in my grip, and I watched through the gap as Chef Briggs, James Briggs, who had a photograph of his daughter, thumbtacked above his spice rack, uncapped the vial, and let a clear, odorless liquid thread down into the Wagyu glaze. Aconitine. I'd studied it 6 weeks ago. Fast acting. Cardiac arrest within minutes. Untraceable unless you knew exactly what to look for, and most coroners wouldn't. The stepmother watched him plate the steak with the satisfied stillness of a woman checking something off a list. Then she straightened, smoothed her blouse, and walked back toward the dining room, passing within 4 feet of where I stood frozen in the shadows, her expensive perfume arriving before her and lingering long after she disappeared. I stood there for 10 seconds. 20. 30. My brain ran through what I'd seen the way it processes a trauma patient's vitals. Fast, systematic, no room for panic. Aconitine in the steak glaze, VIP table, clear instructions. A child held as leverage. I climbed back out to the main floor, and that's when I saw him for the first time. Table 6, VIP corner, the seat with the clear sightline to every exit because men like him always sit with their backs protected and their eyes open. Sim Hyun. I recognized him the way you recognize a storm system moving in from the horizon. Not from a photograph or a name, but from the particular quality of stillness that surrounds something genuinely dangerous. He was striking in the way that expensive things are striking, not flashy, but precise. Dark hair slicked back with architectural perfection. A black suit tailored to a body that carried itself like a weapon. His white dress shirt was open at the collar, no tie, and where the fabric fell away from his throat, I could see the beginning of the tattoos, intricate, dark, crawling up the sides of his neck in patterns that looked ancient and deliberate, like a language written on skin. His hands rested on either side of his plate, tattooed hands, and those hands were reaching for his knife and fork. Across from him, settled into her chair with the posture of a woman who had already won, was his stepmother. She held her wine glass loosely, red pooling at the bottom like a slow-burning ember. Her eyes were fixed on Sim with the patient, unwavering focus of someone who has done something irreversible and is simply waiting for the results to arrive. She looked like someone's elegant grandmother. She looked like a portrait of refinement. She looked like a woman who had just watched a chef poison her stepson's dinner and had gone back to her table to order another glass of wine. My stomach dropped somewhere around my knees. I scanned the restaurant with new eyes. Every table suddenly reorganized itself in my vision, not guests, not covers, not tips, threats. 2 men near the bar who hadn't touched their drinks in 15 minutes. A woman by the door whose posture was wrong, too rigid for someone waiting on a table. A man near the kitchen entrance with his hand resting inside his jacket in the way that means you are keeping something close and accessible. Sim Hyun lifted his knife. I had 30 seconds, maybe less. And I was a 24-year-old medical student with $340 in her bank account and a pharmacology exam next week, and absolutely no reason to do what I was about to do. I thought about aconitine, about cardiac arrest, about the fact that I had seen it happen, had stood in an ER bay and watched a man's heart just stop, and how that was a thing no one should have to experience, not even a Korean Mafia boss eating dinner in a restaurant where he felt safe. I thought, I can't just let someone die. So I reached into my apron, pulled out a fresh napkin, uncapped my pen, and wrote 8 words that would end the life I had been carefully, desperately trying to build. Then I picked up my tray, lifted my chin, and walked toward table 6. Each step felt like walking underwater, the world expanding and contracting around me. I was hyper-aware of everything, the press of my uniform against my shoulders, the distant clink of silverware from another table, the soft sound of Sim's knife beginning to cut into the seared surface of the steak. The dark juices ran across the plate like something bleeding out. He was going to take a bite in approximately 4 seconds. Professional, seamless, invisible. Fresh napkins, sir. My voice came out perfectly even. A small miracle. I leaned across the table to his right side. The way we were trained, always approach from the right. Never reach across a guest, and as I placed the folded napkin over his knife, covering the blade, my fingers pressed the cloth down. The words faced up toward him, hidden against the white of the tablecloth, invisible to the stepmother across the table. My thumb made contact with the back of his tattooed hand for half a second. Deliberate. A violation of every professional rule I had. A breach of the wall between his world and mine. His eyes snapped up to mine. Dark eyes. Sharper than I'd expected. Not cold calculating. The kind of eyes that spend every waking moment reading a room, reading intentions, reading the exact nature of every threat in front of them. They locked onto me the way a blade locks into a target, and I felt the full weight of his attention like a physical thing against my sternum. "Read it," I mouthed. My lips barely moved. "Please." Something shifted behind his eyes, minute, controlled. His gaze dropped to the napkin. One hand moved, slow and casual, to rest on top of it. To the stepmother across the table, it would look like nothing, like a man absently touching his silverware. He read it. I watched his jaw tighten the smallest tell, a compression of muscle along that sharp jawline, and then the stillness returned, that terrifying, absolute stillness. 8 words. And he now knew exactly who had put them there. "Is there a problem with the service?" The stepmother's voice cut across the table like cold water, measured, watchful. Her eyes had moved to me with the specific quality of a woman who does not like variables she hasn't accounted for. Sim set down his fork. He looked across the table at his stepmother with an expression of perfect, composed warmth, the kind of warmth that has teeth in it. "None at all." He reached for his wine glass, slow and deliberate. "I was thinking, this dinner is a celebration, isn't it?" He tilted the glass toward her, a gesture of offering. "We should toast properly, drink from each other's glasses, the old way." The temperature at the table dropped 10 degrees. The stepmother's smile flickered barely, a millisecond of fracture before it resettled into its elegant architecture. "Hyuna, that's a little traditional." His eyes stayed on her, still warm, still terrifying. "You've always said you valued tradition." She looked at his plate, then at her wine glass, then at him, and in that silence, between the ambient music and the distant clinking of crystal, I watched the stepmother understand that something had gone wrong, that the variable she hadn't accounted for was me. Her eyes came back to my face. I stopped breathing. Sim Hyun set his wine glass down with a soft, final sound and said, very quietly, so that only the 3 of us could hear, "Clear the table, please." Not a request. I reached for the poisoned plate with hands that were somehow still not shaking. When I turned away from the table, the stepmother's gaze followed me like a brand between my shoulder blades. I had made it 6 steps toward the kitchen when I heard the sound of a chair scraping back. And then someone near the bar said one word, sharp and low, into a device hidden in his collar. And the obsidian room stopped being a sanctuary. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I genuinely want to say hello and know how far our story is reaching. Let's find out together. The kitchen corridor behind the obsidian room's dining floor was a different world entirely. Out front, everything was amber light and murmured conversation, and the kind of carefully curated luxury that made people feel safe spending obscene amounts of money on a single meal. Back here, the fluorescent strips were merciless. Every surface was stainless steel. The air smelled of reduction sauces and hot metal, and the specific exhaustion of people who'd been on their feet for 6 hours and had 4 more to go. I moved through it the way I'd learned to move through every space that wasn't built for me efficiently, invisibly, taking up as little room as possible. I was 30 seconds from the dry storage room when I heard the stepmother's voice. Low. Controlled. The kind of voice that has never once needed to raise itself to be obeyed. I stopped moving without consciously deciding to. The VIP prep station was at the far end of the corridor, separated from the main line by a half wall of frosted glass. It was reserved for high-profile orders, the dishes that went to table 6, the corner booth that the obsidian room technically didn't advertise but always kept available for the right kind of guest. I'd served that table exactly twice in 8 months. Both times, I'd kept my eyes down and my movements precise, and walked away without processing anything I'd seen, because that was how you survived working in a place like this. Tonight, I wasn't fast enough to look away. Chef Briggs stood at the station with his back to the corridor. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, the kind of build that made the kitchen uniform look undersized, but he was bent forward over the counter in a posture I didn't associate with him. James Briggs was confident in his kitchen in the way that surgeons are confident in an OR, the absolute, unhurried certainty of a person operating in their domain. But right now he looked like something was pressing him toward the floor. The stepmother stood beside him. I'd seen her arrive with the VIP party earlier in the evening and registered her the way I registered all guests: table number, drink order, dietary notes. She'd ordered the Wagyu, the most expensive item on the menu, and a bottle of the 2018 Barolo. She'd smiled at me when I took her order, the kind of practiced, reflexive smile that people like her deploy for service staff without actually seeing them. Silver hair set in perfect waves, cream silk blouse, a diamond ring on her right hand that caught light from across a room. Now she was sliding a small glass vial across the stainless steel surface toward Chef Briggs. My back pressed against the corridor wall. I stopped breathing. "Into the glaze," she said. "All of it. You played it exactly as you normally would, and then you forget this conversation took place." Briggs didn't move for a long moment. His shoulders rose and fell once, heavily. "Your daughter walks home from school alone," the stepmother added. Her voice didn't change. It held the same pleasant, conversational register it had when she'd asked me whether the Wagyu was grain-finished. "Tuesdays and Thursdays, isn't it? Past the park on Renfield Street." Briggs's hands stopped trembling. That was the worst part, the way they went still instead of continuing to shake, the way a man looks when he decides he's out of options. He reached for the vial, his thumb pressed against the dropper, and a clear, completely odorless liquid threaded down in a thin stream into the dark, glossy surface of the steak glaze. I knew what it was before I fully processed that I knew. 6 weeks ago, a toxicology unit. An attending physician with reading glasses and a dry sense of humor walking our cohort through case studies of uncommon poisoning presentations. "Aconitine," he'd said, tapping the diagram. "Alkaloid compound derived from the monkshood plant. Fast-acting, attacks the cardiac sodium channels, causes ventricular fibrillation within minutes of a sufficient dose. Virtually undetectable in standard post-mortem panels unless you're specifically looking for it. Virtually undetectable. Fast-acting, colorless and odorless in solution. Enough of it," our attending had said, and the heart just stops. The stepmother watched Briggs plate the steak with the still, patient attention of a woman verifying a completed transaction. Then she smoothed the front of her silk blouse, picked up the small empty vial between 2 fingers, and turned toward the corridor. I had 3 seconds. I pressed myself into the shallow recess beside the storage room door and went completely rigid, and she walked past me close enough that I could smell her perfume, something expensive, layered, floral in a way that would from this moment forward register in my brain as a threat response. She didn't look at me. I was a shadow in a corridor. I was invisible. I was exactly the kind of person that women like her had spent their entire lives not seeing. Her heels clicked away toward the dining floor. I stood in the corridor for 15 seconds, 20, 30, while my brain did what it does under pressure, not panic, but that cold, rapid triage that my professors called clinical detachment, and I called surviving. I cataloged what I knew. Aconitine in the Wagyu glaze, VIP table, a woman who had just threatened a child to ensure compliance, a man about to eat his last meal. I came back up to the main floor and saw Sim Hyun for the first time. He was already at table 6. He must have arrived while I was in the back, because he hadn't been there when I'd last passed through the dining room. He sat in the corner booth with his back against the wall and a clear sightline to every exit. And I understood immediately and instinctively that this was not an accident, that this man had never once in his adult life sat with his back to a door. His dark hair was slicked back with precision. His black suit was the kind of tailored that costs more than I made in a year. His white dress shirt was open at the collar, and where the fabric parted, the tattoos began intricate, dark, complex as calligraphy, crawling up the sides of his neck in patterns that looked less like decoration and more like a record, a history written in ink on skin. His hands rested on either side of his place setting. Those hands were tattooed too, across the knuckles and the backs, the designs running down to his wrists. And those hands were reaching, with the unhurried ease of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he ordered, for his knife and fork. Across the table from him, his stepmother settled back into her chair with the posture of a woman who had already won. She picked up her wine glass. Her eyes moved to Sim with a quality of attention that I recognized. Now that I knew what I was looking at, the focused, waiting calm of someone who has done something irreversible and is simply monitoring for results. She looked like somebody's elegant grandmother. She looked like a woman who had just poisoned her stepson's dinner and come back to the table to finish her Barolo. I stood at the edge of the dining floor with my tray pressed against my chest and my mind running very fast and very cold through my options. I could find the maitre d'. I could call the police. I could walk into that kitchen, dump the plate, and claim an accident, and then deal with whatever Chef Briggs and the stepmother decided to do about it afterward. I could clock out sick and walk out the front door and spend the rest of my life knowing what I'd watched happen. Sim Hyun's knife touched the surface of the steak. I pulled a fresh napkin from my apron, uncapped my pen, and wrote 8 words. My hand didn't shake. That, I thought distantly, would probably be something to process later. I crossed the dining room. Table 6 was the kind of table that generated its own atmosphere. Even the ambient noise of the obsidian room seemed to quiet around it by a degree, the other guests unconsciously adjusting their behavior in proximity to whatever Sim Hyun was projecting, that particular quality of controlled stillness that precedes violence, the way a drop in barometric pressure precedes a storm. I'd worked in this restaurant for 8 months and served hundreds of powerful people, and I had never once felt the air change the way it changed when I approached his table. I leaned in from his right side, the way we were trained, and placed the folded napkin over his knife. My thumb pressed against the back of his tattooed hand for half a second. Deliberate contact. A violation of every professional boundary and piece of server training I'd ever received, designed to make him look at the napkin before he looked at anything else. His eyes came up to mine like a door opening onto something very dark and very deep. Not cold. Calculating. The kind of eyes that were always, constantly, exhaustively reading threat assessments, running behind them the way code runs behind a screen. They locked onto me with a completeness that made the rest of the room fall away, and for one suspended moment I was not invisible. I was the only thing in his field of vision. "Read it," I mouthed. My lips barely moved. "Please." His hand shifted, slow and natural, to rest on top of the napkin. To anyone watching from across the table, it was nothing a man touching his silverware. His gaze dropped. I watched his eyes move across the 8 words, and I watched, with the focused attention of someone monitoring a patient's vitals for the exact moment of change, as his jaw tightened. 1 degree, barely perceptible, a single compression of muscle along that sharp jawline, and then the stillness returned like a tide coming back in. "Is there a problem with the service?" The stepmother's voice came across the table with the pleasant, measured quality of someone who had noticed a variable they hadn't planned for and were deciding how to categorize it. Her eyes were on me, not warmly. Sim set his fork down. He looked across the table at his stepmother and smiled, a slow, deliberate arrangement of his features that did not reach his eyes at all. "I was thinking," he said, his voice carrying the smooth, unhurried cadence of a man who had never once needed to rush, that this occasion calls for something more intentional, a proper toast. He reached for his wineglass and tilted it toward her, an elegant gesture of offering. Let's exchange glasses, the traditional way. The stepmother's smile fractured. It was minimal, a tightness around the eyes, a barely there hesitation in the hand holding her Barolo, but I was watching for it, and I saw it. She looked at Sim's untouched steak. She looked at his wineglass. She looked at the smile on his face that meant something was very wrong. Hyun, she said, lightly, don't be theatrical. Humor me. His eyes stayed on her, warm, immovable. You've always said family dinners should feel meaningful. The silence that opened between them lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, I watched the stepmother perform a rapid internal calculation. I watched her decide whether what was happening was recoverable, whether she could push through it, whether the thing she was reading in his face was what she thought it was, or something she could dismiss. I watched her decide she couldn't risk finding out. Her eyes came back to me, and in them, I saw the moment she understood that the variable she hadn't planned for had a name tag and 8 words written on a napkin. Clear the table, please. Sim's voice, quiet, final, not looking away from his stepmother. I reached for the plate with hands that remained. I noted this with a distant, clinical kind of gratitude, completely steady. Lifted it, turned, walked toward the kitchen with the poisoned wagyu in my hands and the stepmother's gaze pressing into my back like the barrel of something loaded and waiting. I had made it 6 steps when I heard the chair scrape. Then the man at the bar said one word into his collar, sharp and low, and the obsidian room changed its nature entirely. The first shot came from near the kitchen entrance. Later, I would understand that it was a warning shot aimed at the wall above table 6, designed to scatter the room and create the confusion the stepmother's people needed to move on Sim directly. In the moment, all I understood was the sound, a crack that split the warm, amber-lit luxury of the dining room like an axe through glass, and then the screaming started, and the crystal chandeliers swayed, and every careful, expensive thing about the obsidian room became irrelevant. I dropped. Training, not combat training, but the deep-seated physical instinct of someone who'd spent time in an ER and learned that when violence enters a space, you get low and you get behind something solid. I went down behind the service station, the wagyu plate shattering on the marble somewhere to my left, and I pressed myself against the cabinet and tried to make my body very small. Chaos reorganized the room in seconds. Guests flooding toward exits. Tables overturning. The warm lighting strobing as someone hit a wall panel. Through the gap beneath the service station, I could see shoes, the elegant heels of guests fleeing, the flat tactical footwear of men moving against the current, purposeful and fast. Then a hand closed around my wrist. I reacted on instinct, twisted, pulled, got one shoulder free and looked up into Sim Hyun's face approximately 4 inches from mine. He was crouched behind the same service station, his black suit somehow still immaculate, his expression carrying the focused, slightly bored calm of a man who had been in rooms like this before and found them tedious. You, he said. Not a question, not an accusation, a categorization. Me, I confirmed, because there wasn't anything more useful to say. Can you run? Yes. Then run. He didn't wait for further confirmation. His grip on my wrist shifted not tight enough to hurt, but absolute, the kind of hold that communicates clearly that it is not optional, and he moved, pulling me with him in a low, fast line toward the kitchen doors. The kitchen was its own kind of chaos. Cooks abandoning stations, a prep cook overturning a rack of sheet pans as he fled through the back exit, steam still rising from abandoned burners. Sim moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had memorized the layout before he'd ever sat down at table 6, which I suspected he had. He pulled me past the prep line, past the VIP station where Briggs had stood an hour ago with a vial in his hand and a daughter on Renfield Street, and straight toward the loading dock. Behind us, I heard the kitchen doors blow open. Down! Sim's arm came across me, and we went sideways behind an industrial refrigeration unit as 2 shots cracked through the kitchen. The refrigerator took both of them with a sound like hammers. I pressed my back against the cold steel and breathed through my nose and thought, with the strange, crystalline clarity that extreme situations sometimes produce. I have a pharmacology exam in 9 hours. Sim leaned out from the unit's edge with the practiced, minimal exposure of someone who understood cover, assessed what he was looking at, and then looked back at me. Something shifted in his expression. Not softening, exactly, but a recalibration. "You're not panicking." "I'm panicking internally," I said. "I've had a lot of practice keeping it off my face." Something moved through his eyes that might, in different lighting, have been the beginning of reassessment. Then he said, "Loading dock. 30 feet. On my count." He looked at the refrigeration unit's edge again. 3, 2, Vand. We ran. The car was waiting at the end of the service alley, a black SUV with its engine running, and a driver who didn't ask questions and didn't look at me in the rearview mirror. Sim got in behind me and pulled the door shut, and said one word to the driver in Korean, and the city began moving past the tinted windows in long, dark streaks. I sat with my hands in my lap and assessed my situation the way I'd learned to assess a patient's chart systematically, without the luxury of deciding what I wanted the findings to be. I was in a car with the head of the Korean Mafia. I had interfered with an assassination attempt. The woman who had ordered that assassination had looked me directly in the face and processed me as a problem. My shift had not technically ended. I had $340 in my bank account, a pharmacology exam, and what appeared to be no remaining access to my normal life. "How did you know what it was?" Sim said. I turned my head. He was watching me from the other side of the back seat with an expression that was entirely composed and entirely unreadable, his tattooed hands resting on his knees. The city lights through the window moved across the ink on his neck in patterns of light and shadow. "The poison," I said. "You identified it from watching it go into the glaze. That's not a standard skill set for a waitress. I'm a medical student. 3rd year. I work the dinner shift to cover tuition." I paused. Aconitine, derived from Aconitum napellus. It blocks the sodium channels in cardiac muscle tissue, which causes the heart to go into ventricular fibrillation. Standard post-mortem panels don't catch it unless the examiner specifically suspects alkaloid poisoning and tests accordingly. It's one of the reasons it's historically been called the perfect poison. I looked at my hands. You would have been dead within 4 minutes of ingestion. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. He was still watching me, but with the specific attentiveness of someone who has revised their initial categorization of a thing and is now running a new assessment. "Who are you?" he said. "Lois Hollins." I met his eyes. "I'm a medical student and a waitress and a person who watched someone put poison in your food and made a decision I'm aware may have been extremely inadvisable. That's all I am." The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, and not quite not one. The car descended a ramp, and the city disappeared. The safe house was underground. That was the first thing the way the air changed as we went down, taking on the specific quality of spaces that don't have windows, pressurized and climate-controlled and sealed. The second thing was the size of it, larger than I'd expected. A series of connected rooms that had been furnished with the kind of pragmatic, expensive efficiency that prioritized function over comfort without being uncomfortable. Clean lines, reinforced doors, A medical kit on the wall of the main room that was significantly more comprehensive than anything you'd find in a standard first aid cabinet, which I noticed and filed and thought I might need later. There were 3 men already there when we arrived. They looked at Sim. They looked at me. They looked back at Sim, and whatever they read in his expression made them step back and ask no questions, which told me something about how he operated. He walked me to a room off the main space, smaller, a table and 2 chairs and walls that had been soundproofed, which I noticed from the way my voice would sound flatter than it should when I eventually spoke and sat down across from me with the deliberate patience of a man who had done this before, interrogated people, waited for the specific shape of the truth to emerge from whatever people offered him when they were tired and scared. I wasn't going to be either, if I could help it. "Tell me everything you saw," he said. "From the beginning. Don't condense." So I told him. All of it, the corridor, the frosted glass of the VIP station, the vial, Briggs's hands going still, the stepmother's perfume. I told him what she'd said about the daughter on Renfield Street. I told him the pharmacological profile of aconitine with the same precision I'd have used presenting a case study to my attending, because precision was what I had to offer, and I was not going to waste it being vague. He listened without interrupting. His face didn't change. But I'd been watching him for an hour now, and I was beginning to understand the grammar of his stillness, the different qualities it could have, the way his attention sharpened or receded, the tells that were too small to be called, tells by any normal standard, but were there if you knew how to look. He was listening with his full attention. That meant something. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said virtually undetectable. In standard panels. Yes, but not completely. If an examiner suspects alkaloid poisoning specifically and orders a targeted screening, they'd find it. But that requires someone to tell them to look. Without that, it presents as cardiac event. Natural causes. In a man who has a documented history of high stress and likely has some cardiovascular markers that could be leveraged to support that narrative." He absorbed this. "You understood all of this in the kitchen corridor in approximately 30 seconds. I've been studying for 3 years. The information was already there. I just applied it to what I was seeing." He looked at me for a long, even moment. I held his gaze, because looking away felt like conceding something. "You saved my life," he said finally. Flat, factual, not a transaction being acknowledged, not gratitude being performed, just a statement of a thing that had happened. Yes. Why? I thought about this not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to give him the true one rather than the comfortable one. "Because I couldn't not," I said. "That's the most accurate answer I have. I'm aware it's not a satisfying one." Something moved through his expression that was gone before I could fully catalog it. He stood. "You'll sleep here tonight. There are clothes in the cabinet they'll fit approximately. Tomorrow we'll discuss what comes next." "What comes next?" I repeated. "You're a witness to an attempted murder orchestrated by my stepmother. You've identified a poison sophisticated enough that she needed a medical source to obtain it." He looked at me from the doorway. "You are currently the most dangerous person in her vicinity, who is also still alive, which means you cannot go home. Lois Hollins." He said my name the way he'd said everything else with precise, deliberate weight. "Not until this is finished." He left. The door didn't lock. I noticed that. I didn't sleep much. What I did was lie on the narrow bed in the side room and run my mind back through the toxicology unit materials with the repetitive, grounding focus of someone using information as an anchor. Aconitine. Sources. Synthesis. Detection windows. Antidote protocols there were limited ones, mostly supportive care, management of the arrhythmia while the compound metabolized. There was one experimental protocol I'd seen referenced in a research paper during a late-night study spiral 3 months ago. Something in development at Mercy General's Pharmacology Research Lab, a targeted binding inhibitor that could theoretically accelerate clearance and stabilize cardiac rhythm if administered within a specific window. I'd skimmed the abstract. I hadn't thought about it again. I was thinking about it now. I was also thinking about where aconitine in solution, untraceable grade, in quantities sufficient to kill a man of Sim Hyun's size, would need to come from. It wasn't commercially available. It wasn't synthesized in home labs. It required controlled facilities, proper extraction equipment, and the kind of regulatory blind spot that you'd only find in an institution large enough that the inventory controls had gaps. An institution like, for example, a hospital. A specific hospital whose pharmacology research lab I happened to have badge access to 3 days a week as part of my clinical rotation. By the time Sim opened my door at 6 in the morning, I was sitting on the edge of the bed with my arms on my knees and an expression that he read. I could see him read it correctly. "You know something," he said. "I know where the aconitine came from," I said. "And I know where the antidote is, and we have a problem." He pulled the other chair to the doorway and sat down, and I told him about Mercy General's pharmacology lab, the research protocol, the experimental inhibitor, the fact that the lab's controlled substance inventory had been flagged in an internal audit 2 months ago for a discrepancy that administration had attributed to a data entry error, the fact that I had a key card, the fact that if someone had been systematically extracting aconitine compound from that lab's research stock over the past several months, the remaining vials and the inhibitor, the only thing that could reverse the poisoning if it was ever deployed again, would be sitting in a temperature-controlled cabinet on the 3rd floor of the building, where I spent every Tuesday and Thursday learning how to save people's lives. Sim listened to all of this with the same complete, still attention he'd given me the night before. When I finished, he said, "She framed you. I had gotten there too, somewhere around 3 a.m. The audit discrepancy. If she orchestrated access to that lab specifically because I had a key card, because my badge logs would show regular access, because a 3rd-year medical student with debt and financial stress is exactly the profile someone builds a frame around," I stopped. Yes, she framed me. The moment something goes wrong with Sim Hyun's autopsy, the moment anyone looks past the cardiac event narrative, there's a trail that leads directly to my access logs. Which means the police are not an option for you. The police were presumably never an option in this situation, I said, but now they're actively a liability. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, and there was something in the way he moved, a decision being made, a recalibration completed that I was beginning to recognize as the physical expression of Sim Hyun shifting from assessment to action. "Can you get us into the lab?" he said. "I have badge access. I know the layout. I know the camera positions and the security rotation because I've been there enough times at enough hours to have learned it passively." I met his eyes. "I can get us in." He nodded once. "Tonight, then." Mercy General at 2 in the morning was a different institution than it was during the day. The emergency department still hummed with its own exhausted momentum, but the floors above it went quiet in a way that was specific to hospitals, not truly silent, never truly silent, but reduced to a frequency of beeping monitors, and the soft tread of night nursing staff, and the ambient institutional hum of a building that was keeping people alive in the background without making a production of it. I'd done late rotations. I knew the rhythms. I knew which corridors were monitored by active security and which ones were covered by cameras on a loop, and I knew that the 3rd-floor research wing on a Wednesday night was staffed by one security guard who did his rounds on the hour and spent the 40 minutes between them at the desk near the elevator. Sim had insisted on 2 of his men at the building perimeter. I'd insisted they stay outside. We'd reached an arrangement. We went in through the side entrance that the research staff used, my badge opening the door with a small, familiar beep, and I moved through the building the way I moved through spaces I knew well, without hesitation, without looking like I was hiding, because in my experience, the fastest way to attract attention in an institutional setting is to act like you're doing something wrong. Sim moved differently. He moved like a shadow that had learned to walk upright, absolutely silent, occupying negative space in a way that I found both deeply impressive and faintly alarming. The third-floor research corridor was dim and empty. I found the lab door, badged through, and the familiar smell of the place hit me: reagents, climate control, the particular clean chemical scent that I associated with study and late nights, and a version of my life that had felt, 24 hours ago, like something I was making progress in. I went to the controlled substance cabinet. The manual override required my badge and a 6-digit PIN that the research team rotated monthly, and that I had memorized because I was the kind of person who memorizes things. "Tell me what to look for," Sim said, behind me. "Amber vials, approximately 30 milliliters. The label will say AC7 or the full compound name." I opened the cabinet and began scanning, and a series of vials labeled. I stopped. The rack where the aconitine compound should have been held 4 vials. The research notes I'd seen 3 weeks ago had documented 16, and the inhibitor, the experimental antidote protocol, had an entire dedicated tray. That tray held 2 vials. Someone had been here before us. Recently, the remaining vials were still cold, still properly stored, as though whoever had accessed this cabinet had done it carefully and professionally, taking only what they needed and leaving no visible indication of disturbance for anyone who wasn't looking for a discrepancy. I gathered the remaining vials with the careful, precise movements of someone handling materials that were worth considerably more than their weight in catastrophic potential. Sim watched me work with an expression that had moved past assessment into something I couldn't fully read. "How many doses would the remaining compound represent?" he asked. I did the math quickly, converting concentration to volume to effective lethal threshold. Depending on the target's body weight and the delivery method, I paused. Enough for 4 more attempts. At minimum. The temperature in the lab seemed to drop several degrees. "She's not finished," Sim said. Not a question. "No." I secured the vials in the insulated case I'd brought. The one I'd explained to him was not optional, because temperature-sensitive biological compounds and good intentions were not a sufficient transport protocol. "She has enough for 4 more attempts. She has a frame in place that points at me, and she has whatever timeline she was operating on before tonight, which has presumably only accelerated now that she knows you're alive and I'm with you." He was quiet for a moment. In the dim, blue-white light of the lab, the tattoos on his neck looked like something carved rather than inked, and his expression had the quality of a man who was not afraid, but was making very specific and careful calculations about how afraid he should perhaps consider being. "We need to move," he said. "I know." I closed the case, straightened, and looked at him across the lab bench. "But I need you to understand something first." I waited until his eyes came to mine. "These 2 vials of inhibitor are the only doses of the antidote that exist. If she deploys the compound again, if anyone else is poisoned with what she took, this is what stands between them and cardiac arrest." "I understand." "I need you to understand it in a way that means these vials are protected above everything else, above whatever tactical decisions you make, above whatever I am to you in this situation. Witness, liability, useful resource, whatever the current categorization is." I held his gaze. "These stay safe." Something shifted in his expression. It was brief, and it was complex, and it moved through his eyes and was gone before I could take a full reading of it. But it was there. "They stay safe," he said. "Both of them." I wasn't entirely sure in that moment, whether he was talking about the vials. From the corridor outside the lab, I heard the elevator open on our floor, and then footsteps, not the measured, routine pace of a security guard on his rounds. Fast, multiple sets, moving toward us with the specific, purposeful momentum of people who knew exactly where they were going. The stepmother's people had found us. Sim's hand came to my arm, and the lab's emergency exit was 12 feet away, and we ran. We lost them in the stairwell. Sim knew the building's exit geometry better than I'd expected, better than someone who'd never been inside Mercy General should have known it, which told me he'd prepared for tonight in ways he hadn't mentioned, which in turn told me something about how he operated. He moved through the emergency stairwell without hesitation, down 2 floors, then through a maintenance corridor that opened onto a service dock on the building's east side. His men were there in under 90 seconds. The car was moving before my door was fully closed. It was only when we were 4 blocks from the hospital, in the particular dense quiet of a city at 2:30 in the morning, that I noticed the way he was holding his left arm. Not dramatically, not with any visible distress. Sim Hyun did not appear to be a person who registered pain the way other people did, or at least not in any way he allowed to surface. But there was a quality to the stillness of that arm, a careful non-movement that my clinical eye caught and would not release. "You're hit," I said. "It's managed." I'd like to be the one who determines that, since managing wounds is something I'm actually trained for and you are not. A pause. The city moved past the windows. It grazed the shoulder. It's not serious. A graze can still introduce contamination, damage superficial vasculature, cause infection that progresses to sepsis in 72 hours if it isn't properly cleaned and closed. I looked at him steadily. "Let me assess it when we get back." He didn't agree, but he didn't argue, which I had already begun to understand was the closest Sim Hyun came to conceding a point. Back at the safe house, I set the insulated case on the main table and told one of his men to bring me the medical kit from the wall, the full one, not the travel version. Then I turned to Sim and said, "Jacket off." He removed his jacket without comment. Beneath it, the white dress shirt had a tear along the left shoulder seam and a dark stain that had spread further than a graze had any business spreading, which confirmed what I'd suspected, that his definition of not serious and my definition had meaningful differences. "Shirt too," I said. A brief pause. Then he unbuttoned the shirt with his right hand and shrugged it from his shoulders, and I made my face do nothing in particular, which required a measured amount of effort. The tattoos covered more than his neck and hands. They ran across his chest and shoulders in dense, interlocking patterns, traditional Korean motifs threaded through with imagery that was older and more personal, tigers and phoenixes, and what looked like characters from classical texts worked into the negative space between figures. It was extraordinary, in the way that things are extraordinary when they have clearly been built over years with intention and specific meaning. The shoulder wound was above the left collarbone, a ragged channel rather than a clean entry, which was both better and worse than a through-and-through better, because it hadn't hit anything critical. Worse because the tissue damage was irregular and would need careful cleaning. I put on gloves from the kit and got to work. He didn't make a sound. I'd treated patients who cried over splinters. Sim sat with his spine straight and his right hand flat on the table and his jaw set, and simply waited, with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that pain was a thing you moved through rather than a thing you reacted to. "This is going to sting," I said, reaching for the irrigation syringe. I assumed. I irrigated the wound, debrided the edges, applied the antiseptic. His shoulder didn't so much as flinch. I began closing with the butterfly strips from the kit, not ideal. He'd need proper sutures eventually, but sufficient for tonight, and worked in silence for a moment, because the silence felt appropriate rather than empty. "The tiger," I said eventually, without fully planning to. My eyes had moved to the tattoo on his chest, a tiger mid-stride, rendered in dense black linework, muscular and detailed and somehow both powerful and exhausted-looking, like a creature that had been running for a very long time. What does it mean? He was quiet for a moment. I thought he wasn't going to answer. My father had the same one, he said. Same placement. He had it done when he founded the syndicate, he said. The tiger walks alone and answers to nothing. He had it put on me when I was 22. A pause. The day after he told me I would inherit everything he'd built. I smoothed the last butterfly strip into place and sat back slightly. And the others? His right hand came up and touched the characters along his left ribs, a column of text in a script I couldn't read. These are the names of people I failed to protect. His voice didn't change. Flat and factual, the same register he used for everything, but with a weight behind it now that hadn't been there before. I didn't say anything. Some things don't need a response so much as they need to be heard. My father married her 8 years ago, he said. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the middle distance, at something that wasn't in this room. She came from old money. She understood the business, or she seemed to. My father believed she was a partner. I was in Seoul managing the Eastern operations. By the time I understood what she was doing, what she had been doing for 2 years while I wasn't watching, he stopped. She had moved half his lieutenants to her side. She had built an infrastructure within the infrastructure that he didn't know existed. He died of a heart attack 6 months ago. The air in the room changed. Sim, I said carefully. The medical examiner ruled it natural causes. His jaw tightened in that way I'd learned to read that single degree of compression that was his version of what other people would express with their whole face. He was 61 years old and he had the cardiovascular health of a man 20 years younger. He ran every morning. He didn't drink. He paused. The examiner ruled it natural causes, and I was handed control of the syndicate at the funeral, and she stood beside me at the grave looking like a grieving widow, and a long pause. I didn't understand the full shape of it until tonight, until 8 words written on a napkin. I set down the last piece of tape and peeled off my gloves, and I did something I hadn't planned to do, that existed slightly outside the professional, efficient, medically focused mode I'd been operating in. I put my hand over his, the tattooed right hand still flat on the table, and I left it there. He looked at my hand on his, then at my face. And the thing that moved through his eyes in that moment was not the calculating assessment I'd become accustomed to reading. It was something older and quieter and considerably more vulnerable, and it lasted only a few seconds before the careful stillness returned. But it was there, and I'd seen it. Your father, I said quietly. Were there symptoms before he died? Anything that at the time seemed incidental cardiac irregularities, unexplained fatigue, episodes that could have been attributed to stress? His eyes sharpened. Aconitine administered in sublethal doses over an extended period, I said, can produce chronic cardiac sensitization. It weakens the myocardium gradually. A final sufficient dose, or simply the accumulated damage, would present exactly as sudden cardiac arrest in a man his age, with his profile. I held his gaze. It would be undetectable in a standard post-mortem, unless someone ordered a targeted alkaloid screening within a narrow window. The silence that followed had a quality I hadn't encountered from him before. Not the calculated stillness. Something raw, briefly, before it was contained. She killed him, he said. Not a question. A thing being confirmed that he had perhaps already suspected without the language to name it. I can't prove it tonight, I said. But yes, I think so. His right hand turned beneath mine. Not removing it, turning it, until his palm was against my palm, and his fingers had closed over my hand with a grip that was careful and deliberate, and not at all what I'd expected from him. We sat like that in the quiet of the safe house for a long moment, and I didn't move, and he didn't speak, and something shifted between us that we didn't name and didn't need to. The cartel connection emerged from a shipping manifest. 3 days after the hospital, one of Sim's men intercepted a courier, the old-fashioned kind, a physical package, because some communications are too sensitive for digital infrastructure. Inside was a partial logistics document, port routing coordinates, cargo schedules, and a name I'd never heard but Sim recognized with a stillness that communicated clearly that it was a significant and dangerous name to recognize. Vasily Morozov, Russian, the head of an organization that operated out of St. Petersburg and had spent the better part of a decade trying to establish a foothold in the western port routes that Sim's syndicate controlled. The manifest outlined a transfer schedule, specific berths, specific dates, specific cargo descriptions that used language I was not fluent in, but that Sim translated for me with a precision that suggested he'd been reading documents like this since adolescence. The stepmother had sold them the routes. Not leased, not negotiated access sold. Permanent transfer of the shipping infrastructure his father had spent 30 years building, in exchange for something the document didn't specify directly but that Sim identified, reading between the formatted language, as financial security and a guaranteed exit, a golden parachute built from his family's bones. She was never trying to run the syndicate, I said. We were in the main room of the safe house, the manifest spread on the table between us. She was liquidating it. The murder attempt, the takeover, it was never about holding power. It was about converting it to something portable and disappearing. With Morozov's protection, Sim said, which means if we move against her directly, we provoke a Russian response that the syndicate cannot currently absorb, yes. He studied the document. She built the trap carefully. I looked at the manifest. Then at the insulated case on the shelf across the room, the one with the 4 aconitine vials and 2 doses of inhibitor. I'd been running calculations in the back of my mind for 3 days, the way a problem settles into the background of your thinking and processes itself while you're doing other things. I can synthesize more, I said. Sim looked at me. Not the inhibitor, I don't have the precursor compounds for that, and the 2 doses we have need to stay secured. I met his eyes. But the aconitine compound itself. The extraction process is technically complex, but I understand it from the research literature, and I have the remaining source vials to work from as a reference. If I had access to a proper chemistry setup in 72 hours. I paused. I could produce a quantity sufficient for a single precise deployment. The room was quiet. You're talking about using her own weapon against her, he said. I'm talking about the only leverage that bypasses Morozov entirely. If she's incapacitated publicly, in a way that requires an antidote only we control, she can't execute the transfer. Morozov loses his contact and his contract simultaneously. I held his gaze. And she answers for your father. Something moved through Sim's expression that was complicated and brief, and entirely human. The gala, he said. I'd heard about it 2 days ago. One of his men had picked up the intelligence from a contact inside the stepmother's household staff. She was hosting a masquerade ball at the family's estate, framed as a charity event but functioning, in practice, as the formal announcement of her assumption of the syndicate's assets and the social introduction of her new reign to the city's power structure. The Mafia elders would be there. Morozov's representative would be there. The city's corruptible police brass and the judges she'd bought and the politicians who'd taken her calls would all be there, dressed in formal wear and masks, toasting the graceful ascension of a woman who had poisoned her way to the top. She thought Sim was dead or in hiding. She thought the problem was solved. The gala, I confirmed. He looked at me for a long moment. Can you blend in with the catering staff? I thought of 8 months of black vests and white shirts and carrying plates through rooms full of people who looked straight through me. Better than anyone else you could bring. The synthesis took 61 hours. Sim sourced the equipment through channels I didn't ask about and didn't need to know. The setup appeared in the safe house's back room piece by piece. A portable fume hood, a temperature-controlled mixing unit, glassware that was clearly not purchased at a retail chemistry supply. I worked with the methodical focus of someone who had learned to treat complex problems as sequences of discrete, manageable steps, and I did not let myself think about what I was making or why, because that kind of thinking belonged to after. Right now there was process and precision, and the specific responsibility of producing something that needed to be exactly right. When I was finished, I had a small, sealed vial of clear, odorless liquid, and I labeled it in my own handwriting, and I sat quietly for a moment before I brought it out to the main room. Sim looked at it on the table between us. 1 dose, I said. Enough to cause rapid onset arrhythmia without immediate lethality if we administer the inhibitor within 12 minutes. That's our window. 12 minutes. 11 to be safe. I met his eyes. I'll be the one holding the inhibitor. I need to be close enough to administer it the moment she signs. He looked at me at the vial, then at my face with an expression that had been evolving over the past days into something I was still learning to read. It wasn't the calculating assessment of the first night. It wasn't the careful, controlled distance he maintained with everyone around him. It was something that involved, I thought, a degree of concern that he had not budgeted for and was not entirely sure what to do with. Lois, he said. I know what I'm doing, I said. I've known since the hospital lab. This was always where it was going. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the room, and he stood close enough that I had to look up slightly to hold his gaze, and he said, very quietly, "When this is over." He didn't finish the sentence. But the weight of what he didn't say filled the space between us with a warmth and a specificity that didn't require completion. "When this is over," I agreed. The estate was lit like a stage set. From the catering van at the service entrance, I could see the windows blazing, the shadows of formally dressed guests moving behind the glass, the faint pulse of orchestral music from inside. Masquerade. The stepmother had chosen the theme with the particular confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. There was something deliberately theatrical about hosting a celebration of your power in disguise, as though she was enjoying the performance of it. I got out of the van with the rest of the catering staff, trayed up, and became invisible. This was the thing about serving in places like this. The uniform is a kind of erasure. The black and white, the professional bearing, the practiced neutrality of expression, it doesn't make you anonymous so much as it makes you categorically irrelevant to the people you're serving. You move through rooms full of powerful, dangerous, watchful people, and they do not see you, because they have spent their entire lives training their attention to skip over anyone holding a tray. I'd spent 8 months being erased by it. Tonight, I was going to use it. I moved through the main reception hall with my tray of champagne flutes, reading the room the way I'd been taught to read the ER exits, concentrations of people, points of authority. The Mafia elders were clustered near the east wall. 5 older men in formal wear and ornate masks, who held themselves with the specific gravitas of people accustomed to being deferred to. Near the bar, a tall man with close-cropped blonde hair and a Russian accent that carried across the ambient noise when he spoke Morozov's representative, almost certainly. And at the center of the room, holding court in a white gown and a silver mask that matched her hair precisely, the stepmother. She looked extraordinary. That was the uncomfortable truth of it. She moved through the room with the grace of someone entirely at home in their triumph, working the crowd with a warmth and an elegance that was completely convincing if you didn't know what lived underneath it. She laughed. She touched people's arms. She accepted compliments with appropriate modesty. She was, I thought, the most dangerous kind of villain, one who is genuinely charming. I worked my way around the room methodically, offering champagne, refilling glasses, becoming part of the furniture. I identified her assistant, a young woman in a black dress, who stayed within 10 feet of the stepmother throughout the evening, managing the flow of people approaching her. I identified the moment in the program. The formal toast, scheduled for 10 o'clock, when the stepmother would address her guests and raise a glass to the syndicate's new era. At 9:47, I traded out my champagne tray for a fresh one at the service station. One of the flutes on the tray was not champagne. It was champagne-colored, and it was perfectly temperature-matched to the surrounding glasses, and it contained a compound that would take approximately 4 minutes to produce noticeable symptoms in a woman of the stepmother's size and weight. I knew which flute it was because I had marked the stem with a piece of tape on the inside curve invisible unless you knew to look, which I did. At 9:53, I approached the stepmother's circle with my tray. She didn't look at me. Of course she didn't. I was staff. Her hand reached for a flute with the automatic ease of a woman who had spent her entire life having things brought to her. Her fingers found the marked stem and lifted it, and I turned away before she could feel my eyes on her, and I walked back toward the service corridor, and I breathed. 9:55. 5 minutes. I found my position near the eastern doorway, where I could see the room and where Sim's men, 3 of them, positioned throughout the crowd in formal wear and masks, since an hour before the event began, could see me. The inhibitor was in my jacket pocket, pre-drawn into a syringe, capped, ready. At 10 o'clock exactly, the stepmother moved to the center of the room. The orchestra quieted. The crowd turned. She stood in the warm light with her champagne flute raised and her silver mask gleaming, and her expression composed into something that read, "To everyone in this room, as dignity and authority and the natural culmination of events. To new beginnings," she said, her voice carried beautifully. "To the future of everything my late husband built, and everything we will build from here." She raised the glass, and the doors at the north end of the ballroom opened. Sim Hyun walked in without a mask. He walked in the way he did everything with the particular, unhurried certainty of a man who understood that his presence was its own statement and did not need augmentation. Black formal wear, the tattoos visible above his collar, stark against the candlelight. His eyes swept the room once, a complete assessment in 2 seconds, and then they fixed on his stepmother with an expression that was entirely composed and entirely devastating. The room did not go silent so much as it had silence imposed upon it. A collective stillness that rolled from the doorway outward, as face after face turned and processed what they were seeing. The stepmother's champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. "You should drink that," Sim said. His voice carried without effort, quiet and absolute. "You've already started." And she had. I'd watched her take a sip 4 minutes ago, reflexively, while she was still working the room before taking her place at the center. The compound was already in her system. She lowered the glass. Her face had done something extraordinary, had very nearly maintained its composure, which was a testament to whatever she was made of, before something underneath cracked through. Not fear, exactly. The expression of someone running rapid calculations and arriving, for the first time, at an outcome they hadn't planned for. "Hyun." Her voice was warm, practiced. "You're alive. I'm so relieved we've been. You tried to have me poisoned at dinner." He moved through the room and the crowd parted without anyone consciously deciding to part. "With aconitine, extracted from a hospital research lab. The same compound you used on my father." The word father landed in the room like something physical. The elders near the east wall, the 5 men whose authority predated the stepmother's involvement by decades, had gone very still. Morozov's representative was already moving, quietly, toward the exit, and Sim's men were already, quietly, ensuring that he didn't reach it. The stepmother set her champagne glass down on the nearest surface. Her jaw was tight. Her hand, I noticed, was pressed to her sternum in a gesture she probably wasn't aware of the first flutter of arrhythmia, beginning to make itself known. Right on schedule. You have no proof of any. I have the vials from your chef's private station. I have the security footage from the hospital lab where you sourced the compound. I have a logistics manifest documenting your arrangement with Vasily Morozov. Sim stopped 6 feet from her. And I have a witness to the poisoning who is currently the most credible person in this room. He looked at me. Every head in the ballroom turned. I was still holding my tray. I was still in the black and white uniform, pearl earrings, hair in its low bun. I was, as I had been all evening, entirely legible as someone who worked here. But I met the eyes of the room without flinching, and I met the stepmother's eyes specifically, and I let her see in my face that I recognized her, and that I had been in that corridor, and that I remembered everything. Her hand pressed harder against her sternum. "You're feeling it now," I said. I crossed the room and set the tray down and stood where the room could see me clearly. Irregular heartbeat, some chest tightness. It will become considerably more pronounced in the next 4 minutes. The aconitine compound is affecting your cardiac sodium channels. Without the inhibitor, I reached into my jacket pocket and held up the capped syringe. The arrhythmia will escalate to ventricular fibrillation. The room was very, very quiet. "You know who I am," Sim said, to his stepmother, but loudly enough for every elder against the east wall to hear. "You know what this means. You know what the family's law requires of a member who moves against the head of the syndicate." He paused. "I am offering you an alternative to that law. Once." He produced the document from his jacket, a single folded page, prepared by his legal apparatus over the past 2 days. Transfer of authority, full and unconditional. Every asset, every route, every subsidiary interest, his father's syndicate, returned to his father's name. "Sign it," he said, "and she gives you the antidote and you leave this city tonight and you do not return." The stepmother's breathing had changed. I could see it from where I stood, the slight shallowness, the hand pressing harder now against her chest. She looked at the document. She looked at Sim. She looked at the elders, who were watching with the still, ancient patience of men who had seen this kind of reckoning before and understood exactly what it meant. She looked at me. I uncapped the syringe. "You took a sip 6 minutes ago. That leaves you approximately 6 minutes before the arrhythmia becomes irreversible. You should decide." Something crossed her face, something that was not quite the elegant, composed mask, and not quite the murderer underneath it. Something older and more tired than either. The expression, I thought, of someone who had calculated a very long game and arrived at an ending they'd failed to account for. She reached for the pen. Her signature took 11 seconds. Deliberate, precise, the handwriting of a woman who had signed important documents her entire life and would not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her hand shake, even now. When she set the pen down, she straightened, and she looked at Sim with an expression that contained, buried very deep beneath everything else, what might have been a ruined kind of respect. I crossed to her and administered the inhibitor. It wasn't dramatic. A small injection, inner arm, 30 seconds of waiting while the compound began to bind, and her heart's rhythm steadied back to something that would no longer kill her. She stood very still while I worked, and I was professional about it, because the fact that she had framed me and tried to poison a man, and very likely murdered his father, did not change what I was or what I did, or the standards I held myself to. "You'll want a cardiologist within the next 12 hours, I said when I was finished, "for monitoring." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully decode. Then she said, very quietly, "Who are you?" "Lois Hollins," I said. "I was your server the night you poisoned the steak." And I turned back to the room. She was gone before midnight. The details of her exit, the where and the how, and the precise nature of the conditions attached to her departure were handled in a language and a register that I was not part of and didn't need to be. Sim spent 2 hours with the elders. He spent 20 minutes with Morozov's representative, whose conversation I was not present for, but whose subsequent departure from the city within 48 hours told me everything I needed to know about its content. He made phone calls. He issued instructions. He did, efficiently and without visible effort, the work of reclaiming something enormous. I sat in a chair near the ballroom's east windows and watched the city lights and let the adrenaline metabolize slowly out of my system, the way it always does, not dramatically, but in stages, like something large that has to be carefully set down. The charges relating to the hospital lab, the discrepancy in the inventory, the access logs, the frame the stepmother had built around my keycard, and my rotations were dismantled within a week. I didn't ask how. The paperwork resolved itself in the way that things resolve when someone with considerable resources and motivation decides they should. The pharmacology department received an anonymous endowment that funded a new security system and a comprehensive inventory overhaul. My clinical supervisor mentioned, with some puzzlement, that the audit discrepancy had been traced to a data entry error that predated my rotations entirely. I went back to my pharmacology exam. I passed it. 3 weeks after the gala, on a Tuesday afternoon when the city was doing the particular golden thing it does in the hour before the light changes, Sim came to find me. I was sitting at the bar of the Obsidian Room, not serving, not in the black vest and white shirt. I was sitting at the bar in my own clothes, with a coffee I'd ordered from the current staff, looking at the dining room with the specific kind of attention you give to a place that has been the site of something important and that you are seeing, for the first time, as itself, rather than as the backdrop to crisis. It was a beautiful room. I hadn't fully noticed that before. Sim sat down beside me without preamble. He looked at the room, too, for a moment. "The owner is selling," he said. I looked at him. "The restaurant," he clarified. "He's been looking for a buyer for 6 months. The location, the reputation, the infrastructure, it's significant. The price is negotiable." A pause. "I thought you should know before it went to market." I turned this over in my mind. The dining room. 8 months of invisibility. The napkin and the 8 words and everything that came after them. The life I'd been building so carefully from the outside, always looking in. "I'm a medical student," I said. "I don't have the capital to buy a restaurant." "No," he agreed. "But I do." I looked at him. He was looking back at me with the expression I'd been learning to read over the past weeks, the one that wasn't the assessment or the calculation, but the quieter, warmer thing underneath both of them, that he allowed himself with decreasing infrequency around me. "That would make us partners," I said. "Yes," he said. "It would." The word sat between us with a weight that we were both aware extended considerably beyond its stated meaning. I looked back at the dining room, the chandelier, the white tablecloths, the VIP corner where a man had once been about to take his last bite, and a woman with $340 in her bank account had written 8 words on a napkin and blown up her own life to hand them to him. I thought about invisible. I thought about what it means to serve people who do not see you, and what it means to stop. I thought about my father telling me once, when I was 7 years old and the world was very large and very indifferent, that the only power worth having is the kind that lets you decide who you become. I thought, I am done being invisible. "Tell the owner I'll take a meeting," I said. The corner of Sim's mouth moved that almost smile I'd catalogued on the first night and had been collecting ever since, the rarest and most specific expression in his repertoire. His hand came to rest on the bar beside mine, close enough that the warmth of it was present without requiring anything yet. "I already did," he said. I looked at him. He looked back at me. Outside the windows, the city light was doing the golden thing, and the obsidian room was full of the particular, expectant quiet of a place at the beginning of something rather than the end. I picked up my coffee. Then, I suppose, I said, we have work to do. And that's where our story finds its footing, not in the shadows of what she survived, but in the light of what she chose. Subscribe to see where Lois and Sim go next, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I want to say hello. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Because if you're here, you already know. The most dangerous women are the ones the room forgot to watch.